By the time he was 26 years old, he had quietly helped build pieces of the internet that you have almost certainly used today. He was also a federal defendant, staring down 13 separate felony charges. This is the story of how both of those things were true about the very same young man, at the very same time, and of what it cost to make them true. Let us start with a simple question, the kind that sounds easy right up until you actually sit with it. Who owns knowledge? Not one book or one song or one invention, the whole shared record of what human beings have ever managed to figure out. The science, the medicine, the law, the court rulings paid for by the public. Who gets to read all of it, and who exactly gets to lock the door and charge admission? Hold on to that question. The whole story turns on it. A teenager from the suburbs of Chicago decided that he already knew the answer. He thought the door should be open to everyone. He spent his short, intense life trying to pull that door open with his bare hands. The country he loved, the one whose courts and laws he wanted to set free, answered that idea by bringing the full weight of its criminal law down on top of him. His name was Aaron Swartz. There is a real chance you have never heard it. There is almost no chance you have not touched something he helped make. The way his story ends raises a question this country still has not honestly answered. And the longer you look at it, the harder that question becomes. This is not really a story about computers, even though it is full of them. It is a story about a gap, the distance between what the law technically allows and what the law is actually for. The space between a gifted young man who took far too much of something that was supposed to be shared and a justice system that decided, against the wishes of nearly everyone involved, to treat him like a dangerous criminal. Keep both pictures in your head, the builder and the defendant. They are the same person. Over the next half hour, we are going to do three things in order. First, we will show you who Aaron actually was, and the astonishing list of things he had already built before most people his age had even finished college. Second, we will walk slowly and carefully through exactly what he did at one university and what the law decided to call it. Third, we will sit with the hardest part of all, not the details of how he died, but how a case like his could happen at all in a country that thinks of itself as free, and whether anything was ever truly fixed because of it. One honest note before we begin. We are going to state that fact a single time and with care, and we are not going to dwell on it or dramatize it. If you are struggling while you watch this, the number on your screen can help any time of the day or night. Please use it. Aaron Swartz was born in 1986, just outside Chicago, into a world that was only beginning to come online. While most kids his age were learning the rules of the playground, he was learning the rules of the machine, and then, very quickly, learning that he could rewrite them. By the time he was a young teenager, he was not simply using the early web like the rest of us. He was sitting at the table where it was being designed. When he was just 14, he joined a working group of grown engineers who were drafting a technical standard called RSS. The idea behind it was simple and quietly enormous. It let any website broadcast its own updates in a clean, standard form, so that a program somewhere else could gather those updates for you automatically from 100 different places at once. Aaron co-authored that specification. Podcasts, news feeds, the invisible machinery that pulls the morning's headlines onto your phone before you're even awake. He helped write the rules sitting underneath all of it at 14 years old. Think about the gap there for a moment. Most 14-year-olds are worried about their homework. He was worried about how the whole web should talk to itself. The adults in that group treated him as an equal because on the page in the code, he simply was one. He did not stop there. He went on to become a key collaborator on something called Markdown, a way of writing for the web that is so plain, so close to ordinary typing, that you barely notice it is a kind of code at all. If you have ever typed a message and watched a couple of symbols turn neatly into bold text or a working link, you have brushed up against the kind of quiet, human design that Aaron loved. He wanted the tools of the web to feel like they belonged to ordinary people, not just to engineers. He also helped build the technical layer of Creative Commons, the system that lets a creator say, in language that a computer itself can read, "You may share this freely." Stop and picture that for a second. A teenager writing the plumbing that would let millions of photographers and musicians and writers give their own work away on purpose, legally, to the whole world. The thread running through every one of these projects is the same. He was building machinery for sharing. Other people his age were building ways to buy and to sell. He kept building ways to give. Then his own small startup was merged into a struggling little website called Reddit. And almost overnight, he became a co-owner of a company that would grow into one of the most visited places on the entire internet. People often call him a Reddit co-founder. He arrived there through that merger rather than starting the site himself, so the title is genuinely disputed. And honestly, he never seemed to care about it one way or the other. When the company was sold, the money should have set him up comfortably for the rest of his life. That did not particularly interest him either. Because money for Aaron was never really the point. What lit him up, what kept him awake, was one stubborn idea, and it runs straight through everything he ever made. Knowledge should be free. Not free as in stolen, but free as in open, reachable, unlocked. Free for the curious kid in a town with no decent library. Free for the doctor in a poor country who cannot afford the journal subscription. Free for anyone, anywhere, who simply wanted to understand the world a little better than they did yesterday. In 2008, he wrote that belief down in a short and fierce little document he called the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto. The world's scientific knowledge, he argued, a great deal of it paid for with public and taxpayer money, was being quietly fenced off behind expensive paywalls by a small handful of companies. That, to him, was the genuine theft. Taking that knowledge back and sharing it was not a crime in his eyes. It was something closer to a moral duty. Those words, written by a passionate 21-year-old, would come back to haunt him in ways he could not possibly have foreseen. You should hold a clear picture of him in these years. Not a villain and not a saint, despite how both sides would later try to paint him. A restless, brilliant, sometimes prickly and difficult young man who read constantly, questioned absolutely everything, and could not stop asking why the world was arranged the way that it was. His rare gift was that he could actually build the thing he believed in with his own hands and code. And what he believed with his whole chest was that information was not meant to be caged. For a while, Aaron tried to change the world from the inside, patiently, one useful project at a time. He worked on the Open Library, an ambitious effort to build a single free web page for every book ever published. He built a clever tool to help pull United States federal court records out from behind their paywall, public filings that citizens had already paid for once with their taxes and then were being asked to buy back again by the page. It was quiet work, useful work, the work of someone who still genuinely believed the system could be nudged gently toward fairness. Around 2010, though, his attention started to turn towards something much bigger than any single tool. He had come to believe that the most powerful code in the entire world was not software at all. It was law, the actual rules that govern every one of us, written in a dense language that most ordinary people are never taught to read. If he wanted to change things at the root, he realized, he would have to learn that language. And then he would have to learn how to rewrite it. It was an audacious leap. From writing software to writing statutes, from fixing broken websites to fixing a broken Washington, most people would never even try. He decided that he would. So he founded an advocacy group, and he called it Demand Progress. Not long after, the fight arrived that would show everyone in Washington exactly what this young man was capable of. Inside Congress, two bills were moving quietly and steadily toward becoming law. They were known as SOPA and PIPA. On the surface, they were simply about stopping online piracy, which sounds reasonable enough. In practice, their critics warned they would have handed the government and large corporations a frightening new power to quietly switch off entire pieces of the internet with very little oversight. At first, almost nobody outside Washington was paying any attention at all. The bills looked completely certain to pass, the way most bills backed by powerful industries do. Aaron, together with a loose, sprawling coalition of activists and engineers and everyday internet users, set out to change that fast. They explained in plain and urgent words what the bills would really do once they became law. They took a dry, sleepy piece of legislative procedure and turned it into something that millions of regular people could suddenly see and understand and be frightened by and act on. On January the 18th, 2012, the internet itself went dark in protest. Wikipedia deliberately shut its doors for an entire day. Thousands upon thousands of websites went black in solidarity. Millions of people picked up the phone or sat down at their keyboards and contacted their representatives directly. Within a matter of days, the two bills that had looked utterly unstoppable were suddenly dead on the floor of Congress. It remains to this day one of the largest coordinated online protests in human history, and Aaron Swartz was one of its central organizers. Take a moment to feel how rare that is. A handful of ordinary citizens, with no real money and no lobbyists, beat two bills that powerful industries badly wanted passed. It almost never happens. It happened here, and he helped make it happen. Afterward, he stood up in front of a crowd and tried to explain why, against all the odds, they had actually won. They won, he said, because enough people had decided to make themselves the hero of their own story, instead of sitting back and waiting quietly to be rescued by somebody else. For a young man who had always believed the system could be moved if you only pushed hard enough, the whole thing was living proof. He had just learned something that can be a little dangerous to learn so early in a life. He had learned that he could take on the most powerful people in the country and win. Which brings us, at last, to a university, a small basement closet, and roughly 4.8 million academic articles. To understand what he did, you first have to understand a company called JSTOR. JSTOR is a vast digital library of academic journals, the dense research papers that scientists and scholars spend whole careers carefully producing. A great deal of that research is funded in one way or another by the public, by universities, by taxpayer-backed government grants. To actually sit down and read it, though, you, or more likely your institution, generally have to pay, sometimes a great deal. To Aaron, that arrangement was the exact wall, the precise injustice that he had spent his entire short life arguing against. The scholars who do the research are often paid nothing for the paper. The journals hold the gate. The public ends up paying twice over, once to fund the work through taxes, and then again to be allowed to read it. That was the wall he wanted gone. In the autumn of 2010, he carried a laptop onto the campus of MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the most famous universities on earth. MIT was well known, almost proud, of how open its network was. You did not have to be a registered student to get onto it. Aaron was not a student there, and he did not need to break any lock or crack any password to connect. He simply joined a network that was, quite deliberately, by its own design, open to almost anyone who walked in through the door. Then he began to download. Working through MIT's open network, he started automatically pulling articles down from JSTOR, quickly, relentlessly, in genuinely enormous numbers. Over a span of several weeks, the program he had set running quietly collected somewhere around 4.8 million separate articles. By most reasonable accounts, that came to something like 80% of JSTOR's entire archive, decades of human scholarship, copied onto a hard drive in a closet. And to this very day, after everything that followed, no one has ever actually proven what he meant to do with all of it. Maybe he was planning to release the whole archive to the public, the way his manifesto seemed to call for. Maybe he wanted to study it, to run a single sweeping analysis across the entire body of modern science at once, which was a real and respected research method that he had used before. He never told anyone, and now he never will. What we are left holding is only what the act looked like from the outside. A brilliant young man, alone in a wiring closet, quietly and patiently copying most of a library that he believed should never have been locked in the first place. That single image is the whole case in miniature. No mask, no break-in, no weapon of any kind. Just a laptop, a closet, and a young man who had decided that the lock itself was the real crime. He was, of course, eventually noticed. JSTOR detected the flood of downloads and moved to block it. MIT went hunting for the source of the traffic on its own network. In January 2011, Aaron was identified, tracked, and arrested. The articles were quietly handed back. The downloading stopped completely and was never resumed. Here, in a slightly fairer world, you can imagine the whole story simply coming to a quiet and sensible end. The supposed victim, after all, did not want a war. JSTOR got its content back, reached a civil settlement with Aaron, and stated in plain and public language that it had no interest whatsoever in seeing him criminally prosecuted for what he had done. MIT, whose network it actually was, chose to stay carefully neutral, on the fence, leaning neither way. The two parties with by far the most right to feel angry about all of this had, in effect, already looked at it and decided to walk away. The decision, though, was no longer theirs to make. By the time JSTOR had stepped back, the case had already been picked up by the Office of a United States Attorney. That office looked at the very same set of facts that JSTOR had just shrugged off, and it saw something completely different from a settled little quarrel over downloads. It saw a serious federal crime, one that, in its view, needed to be answered for, fully and in public. In July 2011, federal prosecutors charged Aaron Swartz with 4 felonies under 2 separate laws. The first was the Wire Fraud Statute. The second was the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, a law originally written back in the 1980s in a wave of public panic that followed a popular Hollywood hacking movie, and worded so loosely and so broadly that legal scholars had been warning for years that it could be stretched to turn all sorts of ordinary, everyday online behavior into a serious federal crime. Go and read your favorite website's terms of service sometime. Almost no one ever does. Under a broad reading of this one law, quietly breaking those tiny rules could be treated as a federal offense. That is the law the prosecutors reached for. The U.S. attorney whose office brought the case, Carmen Ortiz, announced it in stark and unmistakable terms. "Stealing is stealing," she said, "whether you use a computer command or a crowbar, and whether you take documents, data, or dollars." To the prosecution, the openness of the network simply did not matter. The civil settlement did not matter. JSTOR's wishes did not matter. He had taken what was not his to take on that view, and that was very nearly the whole of the argument. Then a full year later, in September 2012, the prosecutors did something that turned the heat up very sharply indeed. They filed what is known in the courts as a superseding indictment. With it, the original 4 charges suddenly became 13. 13 felony counts stacked up against a young man whose actual underlying offense was downloading too many academic papers from a digital library that had already publicly decided it did not want to press the matter any further. The scale of the response was starting to look strange to almost everyone watching. This is the moment in the story where you have very likely heard one particular number attached: 35 years. The press repeated it absolutely everywhere. And the thing is, it is technically true in precisely the way that a statistic can be technically true and still badly, dangerously mislead you. If you took every single one of those counts and stacked the maximum possible sentence allowed for each one on top of the last, all the way up, the theoretical legal ceiling did come out to somewhere around 35 years in prison. The number did its job perfectly. It frightened people. It made headlines around the world. It also told you almost nothing true about what was really actually going to happen to him. Almost nobody who genuinely understood the system, though, believed that frightening number described his real future. According to his own defense attorney, Elliot Peters, what the prosecutors actually signaled behind closed doors was a guilty plea in exchange for a sentence of around 6 months. Beyond that, independent legal scholars who study this exact statute for a living, careful people like Warren Kerr, who was certainly no cheerleader for Aaron or his cause, argued plainly that the headline figure of 35 years wildly overstated what he truly faced. The maximum was real on paper. It was also, in practice, a kind of theater. So why on earth not just take the deal? 6 months, perhaps even less, and the entire 2-year nightmare would finally be over and behind him. The reason is that the deal came attached to a price Aaron simply would not pay. To accept it, he had to stand up inside a courtroom and say, out loud, the single word guilty. He had to formally agree to become, for the rest of his natural life, a convicted felon. He flatly did not believe that he was one. He believed he had taken knowledge that should always have been free, and he would not sign his own name to the official idea that this had made him a criminal. So the case simply ground on and on. The constant threat of a public trial, the threat of a permanent felony record that would follow him everywhere. Years of his young life being slowly eaten alive by lawyers, by uncertainty, and by mounting legal bills that climbed into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. For roughly 2 long years, this is what the daily weather of his life became. People who were close to him in that period would later describe a funny, generous, sometimes maddening young man who was being visibly, steadily worn thin by a prosecution that, for reasons no one could fully explain, simply refused to let him go. He was not sitting in a cell during those 2 years. The punishment was the process itself, the waiting, the fear, the sense that the most powerful country on earth had decided to make an example out of him and would not quite say why. Now step all the way back and look honestly at the whole shape of it. The company whose articles he had copied did not want him charged. The university whose network he had used stayed pointedly neutral. The act itself had broken no physical lock, taken no one's life savings, and harmed no human being's body. The answer that came back from the government of the United States was nonetheless 13 stacked felony counts and the slow, grinding, daily pressure of a possible prison sentence. Whatever you finally decide that Aaron did wrong here, and he may well have done something wrong, you are entirely allowed to ask one very simple question. Was any of this remotely proportional? Aaron Swartz did not live long enough to learn how his own case would end. He died by suicide on January 11th, 2013 at age 26. We are going to leave that fact right there gently and move on, because he deserves with everything in him to be remembered as so much more than the very worst day of his story. We cannot, in honesty, pretend that the case was not a heavy part of the world he was carrying on his back when it happened. The two things sat in the same life at the same time. His family and his partner said exactly that, directly and publicly. In an official statement released after his death, they wrote that the decisions made by the prosecutors and by MIT had contributed to his death. They described what happened as the product of a justice system that had been warped by intimidation and by prosecutorial overreach. They called the case itself pointedly a crime with no victims. And they said that MIT had refused to stand up for one of its own when it mattered most. Those are their words, the carefully chosen words of people in fresh grief, and they are the only ones who hold the standing to assign that kind of blame. We are only repeating faithfully what they themselves chose to say. We are not putting words into anyone's mouth. It would be far too simple and not at all fair to the truth to claim that any single thing on its own ever ends a human life. A person is not a math problem with one clean and obvious cause. It is also true, though, undeniably, that a young man who had spent his whole life trying to give knowledge away spent the final 2 years of that life facing a towering wall of felony charges. It is true that a great many serious, thoughtful, unsentimental people looked hard at that fact and saw something that had gone badly and unmistakably wrong. One of those people was Lawrence Lessig, a Harvard law professor who had been Aaron's close friend and his mentor for years. He framed the central question about as plainly as it can possibly be framed. Whatever it was that Aaron had actually done, was the government's behavior toward him remotely, reasonably proportional to it? Lessig reached for a harder, blunter word as well. He described the conduct of the prosecution flatly as the conduct of a bully. MIT, stung badly by all the criticism that followed, commissioned a careful review of its own role in the affair. The resulting report cleared the university of any actual legal wrongdoing. It did not, however, let the institution off the hook lightly. The report concluded that the school had missed a real opportunity to lead, and it quietly questioned whether choosing to stay so carefully neutral in a case like this particular one was ever really neutral at all. Aaron's grieving father rejected that word outright. There is no such thing as neutral, he believed, when a young person's freedom and life are on the line. In the raw months that followed his death, there was an enormous amount of anger, and there were a great many public promises. Lawmakers stepped forward and introduced a bill specifically designed to narrow the very law he had been charged under. They named it, fittingly, Aaron's Law. It would have made it plain in black and white that breaking a website's fine print terms of service is simply not the same thing as committing a serious federal felony. It was the single most obvious lesson of the entire case, written carefully into legislation and seemingly ready to pass. It never passed. It was introduced and it stalled, and then it quietly faded away into nothing, more than once, across more than one session of Congress. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the broad and aging law that had sat at the very heart of his case, was never meaningfully changed at all. More than a decade later, it is still sitting there on the books, still very nearly as sweeping and as vague as it ever was. In that narrow, bitter, legal sense, the door he died trying to pull open is standing today exactly as firmly shut as it was before. And yet, open a browser today, right now, and the world he actually wanted is partly, quietly here. Far more science is free to read now than at any other point in human history. Open access, the idea he was mocked for, is no longer a fringe belief held by a few idealistic teenagers. It is mainstream. The kind of mass protest he helped lead against SOPA is still the working template for how ordinary people fight back against a bad law. He lost his own case, completely, and he went ahead and changed his entire corner of the world anyway. You are using some of his ideas at this very moment, on this very page. That is not nothing. For a man who lost everything he had, it is very far indeed from nothing. So we arrive back finally at exactly where we began. Who owns knowledge? Aaron Swartz spent the whole of his short life insisting that the only honest answer there has ever been is all of us, together. He pushed that single ID further than the law was willing to allow, and the law came down on him for it with a force that, to this very day, a great many careful and thoughtful people still cannot bring themselves to justify. That deep tension did not die along with him. It is still sitting right there, completely unresolved every single time you hit a paywall on a piece of research that your own taxes quietly helped to pay for. He was 26 years old. By then, he had already helped to build the very internet that you just used to find this video. He believed all the way down that the most generous thing a single person can ever do is to share, freely, what they have managed to learn. The very least that the rest of us can do now is to refuse to let the questions he spent his life raising fall quietly silent. So ask the one he asked, out loud, who owns knowledge, and who decided that you should have to pay to learn? If this story moved you at all, the single kindest thing that you can do is to help keep it from fading away. Subscribe so that the next story we tell finds its way to you. If you believe that more people should sit with what really happened to Aaron Swartz, take just 1 second and like this video so that it can quietly reach them too. We will keep telling the stories that genuinely deserve to be remembered. Thank you sincerely for staying with us all the way to the end.